VNAV is part of the automation system installed on the Embraer 170-190 aircraft. VNAV helps reduce the workload on the cockpit, as it is a necessary feature when precise waypoint-based three-dimensional positioning of the aircraft will be vital for aircraft separation. This precise three-dimensional path can be flown based on a combination of lateral navigation with vertical navigation. Both lateral and vertical navigations are calculated by the FMS, which passes data to the flight director system, which in turn generates guidance both to the pilot through the flight path vector symbology and to the autopilot system. Vertical navigation, commonly referred to as VNAV, has several features, some of them sophisticated. The purpose of this video is exactly to make the crews aware of the several details of the VNAV and to provide information about the proper way to interact with it. Let's start by mentioning the basic principles behind VNAV. The understanding of the color code of the labels shown on the FMA and on the PFD in general is crucial to the understanding of VNAV. If, for example, the selected speed on top of the speed tape is magenta, it means that such speed is programmed into the FMS and is being used as a reference by the flight director. Labels in white mean that a mode is armed but not active. For example, if the approach mode is selected, but the aircraft is still some distance from the ILS approach, both LOC and GS will show in white, meaning that they are armed, but not controlling the aircraft yet. The status of the VNAV system is always indicated through its submodes on the FMA, Flight Mode Annunciator. Only one submode is active at a time. The submodes are FELCH, FLCH in magenta, ASEL, ASEL in magenta, ALT, ALT in magenta, and PATH, PTH in magenta. On the hand-up display combiner, just add a V before each of the modes and you will get the correct symbology for VNAV on the top right portion. The captured modes will appear in large-size characters, while the armed modes will be displayed underneath the vertical capture mode in small characters. The vertical navigation is such that it does not follow a path during climb. In that phase, VNAV consists of following a speed schedule as entered through the performance pages of the FMS. The reason the FMS does not follow a path during climb is wind or temperature differences, or yet performance differences that could cause the aircraft to end up at speeds that are not appropriate. VNAV during descent is based on a descent path. The FMS always tries to produce a path that can be flown at the FMS programmed speed and angle on Performance Initialization page 1/3. So, typically, once the crew programs a desired approach at destination into the FMS, then the FMS uses the altitude constraints that are part of this approach procedure to build the flight path backwards until the top of descent point, also referred to as TOD. To maintain the flight path while descending using path, the speed mode depicted on the FMA will be SPDT, that is, speed on thrust. FELCH descent, however, is always SPDE, that is, speed on elevator. As the engines are reduced to idle and the elevators are used to maintain the speed programmed into the FMS, if speed is set to FMS, or to maintain the manually selected speed, if speed is set to manual. VNAV never flies through the altitude pre-selected on the guidance panel. It will never fly away from it either. One of the programmable FMS parameters is the cruise altitude. The cruise altitude is where VNAV changes to the cruise phase and can use the corresponding programmed speeds, thus changing to the cruise mode. VNAV will not switch to the cruise mode unless the cruise altitude is reached. If, for any reason, the aircraft is not allowed by ATC to reach its pre-programmed altitude and assigns to it a different lower final flight level, it is good practice to enter the assigned level into the FMS to make it the cruise altitude, enabling the cruise phase of the VNAV. If, however, ATC assigns a cruise flight level that is higher than the programmed one, and such altitude is pre-selected on the guidance panel, then the FMS will update itself to match the assigned level. VNAV can only be used if FMS is selected as the navigation source. It will not be activated if the source is radio navigation. V/L button selected. If the crew wants to use path, that is, wants to do a descent by tracking the planned vertical navigation, then LNAV must be active. If not, path will not activate. However, if FELCH is used instead of path, then LNAV does not have to be active, but still FMS must be the source of navigation. The difference between FELCH in magenta and FELCH in green is VNAV FELCH does everything FELCH does, plus complies with altitude constraints associated with waypoints and also re-intercepts a programmed descent path if the aircraft ever crosses it. The enunciation changes from FELCH in magenta to path in magenta. In that case, VNAV FELCH does not require LNAV to be active. VNAV FELCH always complies with altitude constraints inserted on the flight plan. The speed restrictions have different meanings if they are at the climb phase or if they are at the cruise and descent phase. Any speed constraint associated to a waypoint during climb means that such speed cannot be exceeded until the waypoint is reached. A speed constraint on descent, however, has the opposite meaning. Such speed cannot be exceeded after the aircraft has flown past the waypoint. The use of VNAV does not require the speed selector on the guidance panel to be set to FMS. However, it is good practice to have FMS-based speed when VNAV is in use, except for takeoff and approach. The use of FMS speed requires that the crew knows how to properly program it, especially those speeds used immediately after takeoff or during approach. The use of FMS speed does not require VNAV to be active either. The construction of a VNAV path between two waypoints with associated altitude constraints can only be possible if the path angle is between 1 and 6 degrees. If a vertical path outside this range is attempted, the vertical navigation maintains the active mode. The FMS generates a scratchpad message causing a yellow MSG blinking on PFD. Altitude constraints of the type at or above or at or below do not necessarily act as constraints. If the path direct to the next altitude constraint beyond that waypoint is in agreement with the at or above or at or below condition, then the waypoint does not impose any vertical constraint. Vertical track alerts, VTAs, are a way of making the crew aware that a climb or descent will be interrupted, or yet that an altitude will be abandoned. A VTA is issued for the following conditions. The aircraft is within 1,000 feet of capturing an altitude constraint that is not co-located with the altitude preselect. In cruise 1 minute prior to top of descent. 1 minute prior to resuming a climb or descent from a constrained waypoint. Prior to resuming a VFELT descent due to speed limit altitude level off. The VTA is also issued as an audible annunciator. The use of vertical direct-to can only be done in cruise or during descent, because it is VNAV based on a path which is applicable only to cruise and descent. VNAV utilizes 5 different submodes to provide vertical guidance. They are ARM, VELCH, ASIL, ALT, and PATH. In the sequence, we will describe each VNAV submode. ARM. When VNAV is selected on the FGP, the initial mode is ARM. The FMS will keep VARM up to the moment that it is possible to determine the vertical mode to use. If the FMS cannot determine which mode to use, or cannot determine whether to climb or descent, it will stay in ARM until the conflict is resolved. While in the armed mode, the FMS does not vertically control the aircraft. Actual vertical flight director mode is used to vertically control the aircraft until the FMS transitions out of VNAV ARM. VNAV remains armed and does not become active when the aircraft is on the ground or at a height less than 400 feet above the departure airport. Vertical flight level change, VELCH. This mode is identical to the FGCS VELCH mode. The selected speed, manual or FMS, will be maintained by the flight guide computer by controlling the aircraft's pitch, that is, operating as speed on elevator, as mentioned before. VELCH is the active mode to perform all climbs and any descent when a descent waypoint constraint is not defined in the active flight plan. VELCH can be requested by the crew at any time during the climbs using the VELCH button on the flight guidance panel. VELCH is the active mode when VNAV is engaged, when the current flight director mode is not altitude hold, and the altitude preselector is above or below the current aircraft altitude. Vertical altitude selection, ASIL. This mode is similar to the AFCS ASIL mode. It will capture the altitude selector or the FMS altitude constraint waypoints. ASIL mode is used during the transition from a VELCH or PATH to level flight in ALT mode. The VNAV altitude target is provided by FMS in the following conditions. During climbs, with an intermediate level off defined by a vertical constraint in the flight plan, and the altitude selector is set to a higher altitude. During descents, with an intermediate level off defined by a vertical constraint in the flight plan, and the altitude selector is set to a lower altitude. Vertical altitude, ALT. This mode is the same as the AFCS altitude hold mode. ALT is used by VNAV to perform level flight operation. The target for the ALT is the altitude set on the altitude selector or a constraint defined in the active flight plan. If VNAV is disengaged while in ALT, the active mode becomes FPA, vertical path. In this mode, the FMS will fly a constant angle of descent between 2 waypoints. This angle ranges from 1 degree to 6 degrees. This angle can be defined by the FMS by an instrument procedure or pilot entered. All these angles can be seen in the active flight plan page. Also, the LNAV must be engaged for a path to be operational. The FMS will maintain a required geometric path, sending a vertical speed command to the AFCS. The AFCS will adjust the airplane pitch to maintain the vertical speed, keeping the proper path. During path, the aircraft speed is permitted to increase or decrease to maintain the path. However, the FMS does provide speed protection. If the descent angle is too steep, the system may not be able to maintain the speed command shown on PFD and on the active flight plan page. Some special procedures may be applied to carry out a late or early descent. Early path descent, late path descent, early descent using direct to, late descent using direct to, early or late descent using descend now. A late or early descent is available when the Descend Now option is enabled on the MCDU pages. This option is available on the flight plan, route, and descent pages when the aircraft is established in the Flight Director mode of VNAV altitude and LNAV, and the distance prior to the top of descent is less than 50 nautical miles, or any distance past the top of descent. However, some prompts such as cancel, exit, resume hold, and departure have higher priority for display. It may result in that Descend Now is presented on some pages, but is not presented on a particular page where the priority rule governs. All altitude constraints encountered prior to intercepting the original VNAV path are respected, as well as the altitude select. When a late descent is initiated by selecting the Descend Now prompt in the MCDU, the path descent profile consists of a fixed angle. The FMS initially guides to a path 1.5 degrees steeper than the original descent path to the point that it intersects the original flight plan. At this point, the FMS automatically executes a transition maneuver to capture the original path. When an early descent is initiated by selecting the Descend Now prompt on the MCDU, the FMS calculates a path descent profile based on a fixed 1,000 foot per minute descent path. The FMS automatically executes a transition maneuver to capture the original path. Early path descent. The steps are as follows. Any time before the aircraft reaches the top of descent, the altitude preselector is set to the ATC cleared altitude. Press the flight level change button to begin to descend. The flight guidance computer switches to VFelch to begin the descent. As the path is approached, the vertical deviation is displayed on the PFD. When the path is intercepted, the FMS switches to path. The flight guidance computer does a normal level off, switching from path to ASL to ALT. Late path descent. We will have the following steps. An altitude constraint is entered at a waypoint. The FMS calculates an angle and TOD for the path descent. 1 minute before reaching the TOD, a vertical alert is given and the vertical deviation scale is displayed on the PFD. When past the TOD and more than 500 feet above the path, the flight guidance computer remains in ALT. The altitude selector is set to the ATC cleared altitude. Press the Felch button to begin descent. The flight guidance computer transitions to Felch to begin the descent. If the aircraft is past the TOD and more than 500 feet above the path, the FMS remains in Felch. If the aircraft is past the TOD but less than 500 feet from the path, when path is intercepted, the flight guidance computer switches to path. The flight guidance computer does a normal level-off switching from path to ASL to ALT. VNAV early descent using direct to. The following steps apply. An altitude constraint is entered at a waypoint. The FMS calculates an angle and TOD for the path descent. The altitude preselector is set to the ATC cleared altitude. A vertical direct-to is performed to the constrained waypoint. The FMS calculates a new angle and the flight guidance computer transitions to path. The flight guidance computer does a normal level-off, switching from path to ASL to ALT. VNAV late descent using direct-to. In this scenario, descent clearance is not received before the TOD is reached. The following applies. An altitude constraint is entered at a waypoint. The FMS calculates an angle and TOD for the path descent. 1 minute before reaching the TOD, a VTA is given, and the vertical deviation scale is displayed on the VFD. At the TOD, the flight guidance computer remains in alt and remains level through the TOD. The altitude preselector is set to the ATC cleared altitude. A vertical direct to is performed to the constraint waypoint. The FMS calculates the angle and the flight guidance computer transitions to path. VNAV usage. Full programming of the FMS performance pages is essential for the use of VNAV. If some programming is lacking, the VNAV may not arm, or the FMS may not be able to calculate a descent path, or may use the wrong speed for climb, cruise, or descent. It is important to remember that if VNAV is armed on the ground prior to takeoff, VNAV in white will show on the lower part of the FMA, and it will become active 400 feet above the departure airport, and will command the aircraft to accelerate to whatever speed is programmed in the departure speed page. The departure speed page can be accessed through the performance initialization pages. This page not only has a reference speed, but also shows an altitude and a distance. The altitude and distance, whichever occurs first, are references for the FMS speed to switch to the next altitude speed constraint, which is by default 250 knots at 10,000 feet, as seen on the Performance Initialization page 3/3. After crossing the Performance Initialization page 3/3 restriction, the FMS speed transitions to the climb phase and consequently switches to the speed programmed for climb in the climb page. En route speeds can be programmed either on the Performance Initialization pages or on the climb, cruise, and descent pages. During climb, the FMS speed will match those on the climb or Performance Initialization page. The speeds on those pages are always synchronized. If a different climb speed is entered into the climb page, the Performance Initialization page is updated accordingly, and vice versa. The aircraft speed is updated after a few seconds. The change in the target speed can be observed in the form of a shift of the magenta speed bug on the speed tape. The vertical mode changes to ASL as the aircraft approaches an altitude constraint. How far before the constraint the ASL goes active depends on the climb rate. The higher the climb rate, the earlier ASL becomes active. In cruise, the VNAV submode that remains active is VNAV alt. If the current altitude is not yet the final altitude programmed in the FMS, and VNAV is to resume climb at a certain waypoint, the aircraft will leave the altitude it is at as soon as that waypoint is reached, if the preselected altitude is above the current one. Remember, the altitude selector must always be set to the altitude cleared by the air traffic control. The difference between VNAV alt, ELT in magenta, and alt, ELT in green, is that in VNAV alt, if the preselected altitude is set below the aircraft altitude, it will clear the altitude on its own upon reaching the top of descent. The top of descent appears as a little diamond somewhere along the navigation shown of the MFD. That point is the ideal one where descent can be initiated. If the preselected altitude is set somewhere below the current level altitude and VNAV is active, then the aircraft automatically starts the descent at the TOD. However, in practice, more often than not, the descent is begun at positions different from the TOD. due to air traffic constraints. There are three possible ways of adjusting vertical navigation to correct for a different type of descent: vertical direct to, VFelch, and descend now, as previously shown. The recommended method is descend now. For early descents, selecting the descend now prompt, the VPath mode starts an early descent at 1000 feet per minute till intersecting the original flight path. Selecting descend now for late descents, the FMS creates a path 1.5 degrees steeper than the original path till intersecting the original flight plan. All descent altitude constraints encountered prior to intercepting the original VNAV path is respected, as well as the outsell. No VTA is given for the transition maneuver using the descend now prompt. The alternative methods are direct to and felch. Vertical direct to consists of basically commanding the FMS to descend on a constant path angle between where the aircraft currently is and a certain waypoint picked up from the flight plan. It is important to keep in mind that a vertical direct to does not imply a lateral direct to. In other words, if the crew programs a vertical direct to a waypoint that is the third in a sequence ahead of the aircraft will still fly over the previous waypoints before reaching the one used as a reference for the vertical direct to, but it will use the same descent angle all the way and will ignore any altitude constraints previously associated with the intermediate waypoints. However, the converse is true. A lateral direct to a waypoint does imply a vertical direct to that waypoint. As the direct to page provided by the active flight plan supports only lateral direct to, a vertical direct to is programmed by pressing 2 times the right select key next to the waypoint one wants to program a vertical direct to. The first time it is pressed causes the corresponding altitude to be copied onto the scratch pad. The second time it is pressed causes the altitude on the scratch pad to enter on the waypoint as an altitude to go to. The logic behind this interface behavior is, if an altitude is entered onto a waypoint through the corresponding right select key is different from the active altitude for that waypoint, the system understands as an update and the vertical path is recalculated, but without a vertical direct to. But if an altitude identical to the active one for the waypoint is entered, then the system understands as a vertical direct to. Sometimes there is no waypoint properly located along the descent path to allow a vertical direct to. In that case, a waypoint can be created based on an existing one by using the double slash method. VFelch is used during all climbs unless a path is defined. During descents, the speed command is displayed on the active flight plan page 1. Care must also be taken when using vertical direct to on a late descent because the resulting path may be steeper than 6 degrees. In that case, the resulting behavior is the system maintains the active vertical mode and generates a scratch pad message. In this case, the felch descent is recommended, but if an interception is desired, the extra drag, namely the speed brake, should be used. To start a felch descent, press the felch button on the guidance panel with the VNAV engaged. The vertical deviation from the programmed descent path can be seen on the vertical scale that shows on the PFD or in the VNAV data page. The VNAV data page can be accessed by selecting Progress, Next, VNAV Data. The vertical deviation on that page is shown in alphanumeric form and is very handy if the deviation is large because it always indicates the true deviation no matter how large it is. as opposed to the vertical scale on the PFD, which only shows deviations of 1,000 feet or less. If VFELT is used to descend, and the vertical deviation is less than 500 feet when an early or late descent is initiated, the system switches directly to path. VNAV, if properly used, allows a lower workload on the cockpit by reducing the number of pilot interventions. However, careful training is required to have the crews proficient at using this functionality.